there's nothing inherently sacred in the world. No mountains, no people, no plants, no whatever, if that's how you treat them. But if you treat life as sacred, then everything is sacred.
Bienvenidos a Volver al Futuro Podcast, donde platicamos con las mentes que nos impulsan a crear el nuevo paradigma de salud y bienestar, conducido por Víctor Sadia.
Hello everyone, we have today Jamie Metzl.
Jamie Metzl es futurólogo de tecnología y salud, experto en geopolítica, novelista, empresario y colaborador de varios medios de comunicación. Es Fellow del Atlantic Council, miembro de la Facultad de la Universidad Singularity, fundador de One Shared World y consultor de la Organización Mundial de la Salud. Ha trabajado para la ONU en derechos humanos, así como en el Consejo Nacional de Seguridad y en el Comité de Relaciones Exteriores de los Estados Unidos.
Jamie, thank you so much for joining us.
Victor, it's really my pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about how your career started and what did you think at that time that you would become 20 years from then?
So I don't want to go back to the very, very beginning, but what I will say is when I think about my career, I go back to something that happened just at one moment when I was 18 years old and a freshman at Brown University here in the United States in Rhode Island. And I had helped organize a conference on social justice and racial awareness, which is apropos to what is happening in the world today. And I met a classmate of mine named Arn Chornpond, and Arn had been born in Cambodia. They had a similar tragic story to many other Cambodians. Most of his family was killed. He'd been then fled across the border, was in a refugee camp where he was adopted by an American aid worker, which is how he came to the United States. And hearing from him about his story and this horrible tragedy that had happened to him and his family in Cambodia, I felt very ashamed that this had happened during my lifetime, and nobody I knew anything about it. And so I went to the library and I checked out every book on Cambodia. And I started reading, and it really hit me. I'm the son of a refugee. My father and grandparents came to the United States after World War II, fleeing Nazism. And so this story was very familiar, and it felt very personal. And so I asked myself, well, what's my responsibility? And so that summer, again, I was 18, I quit my summer job on the first day. I had a garage sale of all the junk in my parents' house. I bought a ticket and got on a plane and flew to Thailand and went, it's kind of crazy now, I went to a refugee camp on the Thai-Cambodian border and said, hey, I'm here, I want to volunteer, how can I be helpful? And they put me in charge of first teaching English to refugee children, and then I rewrote the curriculum for the school and the refugee school, and then was in charge of training all of the teachers. And it really struck me, both this terrible tragedy that these people had experienced, and in many ways the indifference of the rest of the world. But the other thing that struck me was that we could all spend our whole lives at the tail end of problems. Refugees aren't the beginning of a problem, they're the end of a problem. And so if we wanted to fix the beginning of the problem, we had to really go to its source. And that led me to law school, to doing my PhD, to working in the US government and in the United Nations, looking at all of these big issues. And in the late 90s, I was working on the U.S. National Security Council, and my then boss, Richard Clarke, was the person who essentially predicted 9/11, but couldn't get anyone to do anything about it. And Dick always used to say that the best way to be effective in life is to anticipate the future and try to drive real change. And so for me at that time, and this was 23 plus years ago, I kept seeing this story, at least in my head, that the genetics and biotech revolutions were going to change everything. And so I started educating myself. When I was ready, started writing articles, was invited to testify before U.S. Congress, and was doing a lot of reading, of writing and speaking. And then I was I just recognized that I wasn't breaking through. And that inspired me to write. I'd already written 2 books already, one of them a novel, but to write my 2 near-term sci-fi novels, Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata, telling the story of the genetics revolution, but as a story, as a thriller. And when I was on the book tours for those books and I explained the genetics and biotech revolutions in the way that someone like me who was entirely self-taught would, I could see they suddenly got it. And that was when I realized that I needed to write the nonfiction book, but it's the greatest story of all time, the story of our genetic being and becoming, and that's Hacking Darwin. And now I have been for a long time, very involved in that world. I'm a member of the World Health Organization, International Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. I'm doing a lot in education and outreach around these big issues of how do we as a humanity deal in the most responsible way with these incredibly powerful and godlike technologies.
That was a very brief and fully packed intro. Thank you. So going back to that moment where you got struck by these friends' experience in Cambodia, do you think that resonated with your own history in your family, where you lived that exile from Europe, from fleeing Nazism, and in some way it was a way of understanding that same thing and trying to repair something that had already happened in your family's DNA?
Yeah, 100%. I had grown up I was born 23 years, it seems crazy now, 23 years after the end of the Holocaust is 1968 when I was born. It feels like nothing. And growing up, we always had said, never again, never again, never again. But then it struck me, that doesn't mean anything if it's just never again to my little group. It should be never again to anybody. And in Judaism, there's a concept called Tikkun Olam. And it means the essence of it is that the world is kind of cracked, and it's every person's responsibility to do their little bit to try to heal that crack. So certainly it was an intersection of my family history, and then that gave me a charge and a sense of personal responsibility of my role. And really, it made me think deeply about how I want to spend my life. And certainly, there are times when my girlfriend gets mad at me. She said, all right, hold on a second. You kind of could have gone to Goldman Sachs and you didn't. You had an offer from McKinsey and you didn't accept it, and all these other life paths. But for me, trying to solve these big global problems, what could be a more valuable use of what energies we have?
Was that concept of Tikkun Olam introduced to you when you were young? That's something that you now look backwards and say that you have been doing that all along?
I think that every culture has its version of Tikkun Olam. Every tradition has a sense of what is the responsibility of each individual. And so certainly if I was a Tibetan Buddhist, I would have just a different name for the exact same idea. If I was a Muslim, if I was really an anything. And so certainly that one articulation was part of my cultural background, but I think that that's a universal principle.
When I met you at Singularity University Exponential Medicine, you have a lot of books read about science and technology. And at the same time, it was probably Tuesday night, and you conducted a sacred cacao ceremony, which really struck me as something that you wouldn't expect from a tech expert. What does that mean for you, and why are you doing it, I think, regularly?
So anyway, thank you for asking, because of all the things that I can talk about, talking about being a cacao shaman is really one of my favorite things to discuss. And so first, let me just get this off on the table. I love chocolate. Everyone should love chocolate. If you are a smart person, you love dark chocolate. If you're slightly deranged, you're a milk chocolate person. And if you say, oh, I love chocolate and white chocolate is my favorite chocolate, literally, I don't mean this in a judgmental way, but there's something wrong with you. And so as a starting point, and so I just have always been I'm interested in a lot of things. But the history of cacao, which is connected to so many things, the Aztec and Mayan history, the connection between the New World and the Old World, And so what actually happened was I was in Berlin and I was speaking at a conference called TOA, Tech Open Air. And when I was in Berlin, I was invited to 2 sacred cacao ceremonies. I didn't know that was a thing, but in Berlin, everything happens and everything is possible. And I just love them because it was like, I don't do drugs, I don't drink, but this was like this kind of amazing experience where people were totally free. The first one, I had to leave early because we had the opening dinner for TOA, but my friend stayed and sent me pictures of what happened. And I can't imagine if that this could have been any wilder had they been using cocaine instead of cacao. But it was just great. But I came home and I had 2 ideas. One is I really want to start doing these cacao ceremonies. And 2, I think I can actually do a better job than these wonderful people in Berlin. So there's a theme here. I get an idea in my head and then I start educating myself. So I learned everything I could about cacao and about these sacred ceremonies. And then I looked for accreditation. And it turned out that there's no such thing. There's no accreditation to be a cacao shaman. You want to do it? Put up your little shingle on your door. I don't charge anything, so I do it all for free. And I started doing these ceremonies, and I just loved it, and people loved it. And the basic message is that there's nothing inherently sacred in the world. No mountains, no people, no plants, no whatever, if that's how you treat them. But if you treat life as sacred, then everything is sacred. Water is sacred, other people, nature, anything. And so to have these ceremonies, say, well, for the purpose of this ceremony, we're going to focus on this one substance of this cacao that's been used in these ceremonies for a very, very long time, some say almost 1,000 years. And second is that the way to a happy life is to just have appreciation for all of the details. And so that's the essence.
You usually don't hear this sort of connection-seeking mindset in the tech, I guess, in the tech world, where everything's so technical and specific about the topic. So it's really interesting how it is the same world. It's not 2 separate worlds. You just reminded me on your interview with Joe Rogan when he's talking about psychedelics and you're making your point that you don't do them. And I really resonated with you on that sense because, we have the potential to just go there if we want with our own power. And I loved it because he pointed out the way that you were kind of pressing his point so that you can make yours. And then you said, I got a bit uncomfortable there and showed your vulnerability and then said, that's something that we're looking for in this conversation. And I think at that point, you had a lot of connection. And that's basically what happens when we really put ourselves out there. And, I'm derailing a bit, but I just got reminded about in your sacred cacao ceremony, I don't know if this is relevant, but I stood up and it was dark. And I just picked one of those chocolate jars. And the person who was going to give a concert after the ceremony just got his whole suit stained. And, it was a big thing. We went to the restroom. He had a concert in like half an hour. And at the end of the day, it was like, I was really concerned. And he said, listen, my friend, I felt your heart. And this is what I need from you now. Like he was, at first he was just in shock. And then we really connected in the restroom, me trying to clean his shirt. So yeah, again, we really got there with your ceremony, but in a different way.
That's great. I didn't know that story, and I think that's this whole thing in life. Every experience is an opportunity to grow, to connect, or not. Your same story could have devolved into something terrible, and it didn't. And I think that's all of life. Is this opportunity, even the tough things? Yes.
So part of the thing that you're working on is talking about how we live in sick care and not in healthcare. And in a sense, you want to use technology to empower us and not only think that the solution will be a technological one, both in the realms of genetics itself, but in general with all the med tech that we have nowadays. How can we really leverage and understand this as the same boat?
Yeah, it's a really important question because right now what we have is this world of sick care. You wait around and then you have a symptom and then the symptom gets worse and then you go and get some kind of treatment. But that symptom could have been germinating for a long time, maybe even since conception. And so if we can have more information earlier in the process, perhaps we can eliminate a threat entirely. Perhaps we can mitigate it. There's a lot that we can do. And so what I would say, this is not my own invention, but moving from this world of generalized to precision healthcare based on each person's individual biology is a first step. But because of that transition, we're going to get a lot of more information, genetic and otherwise, and systems biology and life information about people. And because humans, in many ways, among other things, we are big, massive data sets, our lives, or many important aspects of them, including our aspects of our health and well-being, are going to be increasingly predictable. So it's from precision to predictive is the next step. So if you know that you're at an elevated risk for type 2 diabetes, that may change your lifestyle. If you know you're at elevated risk for a genetic form of breast cancer, you may want to test early. I think that's where our healthcare has to go. And I think it will, but we have this mindset that it's okay to wait until there's a symptom, but to somehow do a whole genome sequence of your newborn child, like that's some kind of a violation. That's wrong, but it will change.
In a sense, this part of the predictive nature of new technologies, it's really bridging us to the other P, which is preventive and personalized and participatory. And
Correct.
how do you see that genetics, because it's so high tech and people really conceive that as, wow, they really got to peek into my own genes, that we're really going to believe them that, chronic disease is the most likely thing that will happen in our lifespan. How do you think that technology is really allowing us to really believe these predictions and change our behavior collectively?
Yeah, it's really hard because we're all locked into these models of what we want. Like if you go to your doctor, my brother is a sports medicine doctor, and if people go to see him and he says, yeah, you should strengthen your legs, they're kind of pissed off. It's like, no, I want surgery. So people are conditioned to want certain outcomes, even if those outcomes are bad for them. So we have to change people's mindset to thinking about, well, exercise is what we now think of as medicine. Health is medicine. Diet is medicine. Lifestyle, all these kinds of things that we think of as soft science. Like if somebody is encouraging you to eat healthy and exercise, that's like some kind of coach, and you pay them whatever, $60 an hour. If somebody is doing some super high tech, totally unnecessary surgery, like that person is like a god, and we pay them $10,000 an hour. And I think that we just need to change the way that we think about this whole superstructure.
With this genetic revolution that we're seeing, and I've heard you speak about how this moment in history will really define the future of many things, including the way we perceive ourselves. What are the main trade-offs and the big problems that the genetic revolution will bring, because it won't be initially evenly distributed throughout the whole population? And which biases and ways of thinking might we see when we start to introduce this on a massive scale?
Yeah. So there's two questions embedded in that. The first is, how do we think about what's a human? We have this traditional view of thinking of humans as magic, and this concept that there's a soul, and this soul is kind of floating around, and then it occupies this matter. Like that's one way of seeing what people are. Another way, maybe it's not entirely exclusive, is that we're single cell organisms gone wild over 4 billion years of evolution. And that theological question is really important, because once we start saying, well, much of what we are, not everything can be actually predictive, that we are made up of this code that can tell us a lot about future personality styles and risks and capabilities, it's very uncomfortable to a lot of people, and for good reason. And then when we take the next step toward applications that will become over time more and more meaningful, if we're not careful, there's a chance that the wealthiest people will be the ones who benefit from this life-altering technology. And we've seen from European colonialism what happens when one little group has or believes they have some massive advantage over everybody else. But that's not inevitable. I mean, this is in many ways a societal question. It's a regulatory question. It's a funding question. And there are countries that are more egalitarian, like Israel is a good example, that use their regulatory infrastructures to make sure that various resources are relatively well distributed, including healthcare and access to new technologies. Countries like Mexico, like the United States, are unequal, and the risk of this kind of bifurcation in those kinds of societies becomes greater.
What advice would you give doctors in Mexico that they're now being approached by several companies who are offering genetic testing for their patients and things like this? How must they think about the possibilities of genetics in the clinical practice today? And also what implications will have for the future in the field in general?
So right now, let's like I've done this. I don't know whether you've done this, Victor, but I've had of course I've done 23andMe, but I've also had my whole genome sequenced. And when I got the information back, I didn't get that much more actionable information than I got even from 23andMe. But where we're going is if that's going to be very different. And so I think right now the key is I definitely think that everybody should have their whole genome sequenced. The cost is going down. It's around $700 now. It's going to be, well, within a decade, it'll be lower than $100 and ultimately free. And we're going to have it. So why not get that information? But it's an investment more. A small percentage of people, you get some actionable information. But it's an investment in having more information in the future, because as we move toward more and more people having their genome sequenced, and we bring together these massive data sets of genetic and phenotypic life information, we're going to understand more and more of what genetics do. And so it's going to be more and more actionable. But from a physician standpoint, it's important to not oversell what people are getting, because right now people have a lot of faith in science, and they think, well, if I get my whole genome sequenced and it says some kind of, I have an elevated risk of something, or a lesser risk than average of something else, that may not be enough to justify some big lifestyle change. So we need counseling, but this is really relevant information, and it's only going to get more relevant. And if you're going to do it at some point, you may as well do it now.
What I think it's really interesting and empowering at the same time is that we do expect to have this kind of genetic determinism where your genes will determine everything in your life. And now we know through epigenetics that, your environment and your own lifestyle will really trigger some genes and others. So this is an important discussion. We will have the information, the data, even the big data, but at the same time, we'll have a lot of power to manipulate genes, but not through CRISPR and the technologies, but only through our words, our shared meanings, and our lifestyles, the way we eat and behave and connect with others. So I think it's an important technology to also put some attention, the technology of the human behavior.
Yeah, I completely agree. And then we can't fetishize genetics. I mean, we have our systems biology. Genetics is the source code. So your genetics create a range of possibility for you. And so, but within that, there are all these other systems. Epigenetics is critically important. And even if we are predominantly genetic beings, as I believe, and there's a debate about how genetic we are, and I write about this in Hacking Darwin, when you kind of sum it all up, roughly we're about half genetic and half environment. And even that environment is partly genetic, like the genetics of your parents and siblings and things like that. But that means, let's just say it's 50-50. That means there's 50% of your outcomes that you can influence by all of the different things that you do. And you don't have, complete control over the full environment. But what you eat, whether you smoke or don't smoke, your positive attitude, sleep, all the kind of blue zone things are just good things to do.
How can we think in a complex interdisciplinary way? We know that everything is interconnected, the social, the economic, the cultural, the technological. And, for understanding, for epistemological reasons, we do separate in different fields, but they're not separate. So how can we think in that way?
Yeah, it's so important because nature is not divided into all of our little fields of chemistry, biology, physics, and whatever. Those are just shorthands for us to kind of capture pieces of knowledge. And I think what we're finding now, it's the E.O. Wilson word is consilience. Another word for it is superconvergence. That's what we're experiencing now. And certainly we need people who are super experts, but it's kind of impossible to be a super expert in just one vertical without really understanding widely. And that's why I think the nature of learning just has to change, and we have to think in these integrated ways. And it's hard. and it's hard for all sorts of people. I mentioned my Jewish heritage, and I think the kind of studying Talmud, which I did when I was a little kid, even though I kind of have gone my separate ways theologically, it's kind of useful about like that everything is a web, an interconnected web. And knowledge is that. It's this interconnected web. And so we need to be, like, if you really want to understand science, you need to be studying literature, not because it's fun, but because what this is about is insights and growth and knowledge, and all of these pieces are connected.
How can we talk about this with physicians in the medical community who were trained in a very specific field for so many years, and that they sometimes forget this overview about the whole system as a system, and how their patients is more than their organs and tissues, but also their social organs and tissues, and their political and economic and cultural?
It's so important because you start with the training of the doctors. I mean, everyone in my family is a doctor. And it's like, you know, when you go to the butcher shop and there's that little picture of the cow and there's like a dotted line and like rump roast and leg, and that's the way it is. It's like, oh no, I'm the ear, nose, and throat guy, and I get from here to here, and I'm the arm. My little brother's a foot and ankle surgeon. He's got like a little carved out piece of the body. So one is we need to have a more systems approach. I mean, there's a lot to be said about Western medicine, but traditional medicines are much more focused on the system of a human. And then the second thing is just continuous learning. I think there's one thing for doctors who need to get continuing medical education credits, and that's certainly important. But let's say you've been out of medical school for 15 years, which is not very long time. You know nothing about genetics as a doctor. So if you are planning on having your entire career knowing nothing about genetics because you couldn't have really learned much of it in your medical school, it's like you're going to be a terrible doctor. You probably in your medical school didn't learn much about diet and exercise, even though the more we learn, that's probably among the most effective interventions across time. And so it's not just for doctors, it's for everybody, is that to be good at what you do, you have to be constantly learning. And like I'm sure there was a time where you finished your training and then you live off of what you've learned for the next 45, 50 years of your career. That's no longer the case. I mean, somebody who's graduating from medical school now, if you went on a time machine to 30 years from now, it would blow your mind. Other than in countries where there's some kind of government reason that things get slowed, but the cutting edge medicine 30 years from now it'll be science fiction today.
Do you have a tip for those of us who love to learn on how to constantly zoom in the specific of things and then zoom out to see how everything is interconnected? Is there a way that you proceed, because you really have this generalized but also super specialized knowledge about so many topics? How do you proceed? Even more than being curious, just how do you build this system in your mind of thinking?
I don't know if I have a good answer to you, because it's how my brain has always worked. But it's what I said before. You have to be learning and exploring well beyond your field. And that's why, people who are in the hard sciences, like reading literature is part of your job, because that's what literature is. I mean, sometimes you have like a Marcel Proust, which is like, we're going to kind of really go deep into one thing, and the experience of one Madeleine cookie dipping into the tea. And sometimes it's broad, but I think that we really have to challenge our minds. I mean, the way our minds are structured for survival in the African savannah, they're not fully structured for comprehending the vastness of this universe that we now are exposed to. And so we have to be constantly training ourselves. It's not a fulfilling answer, but I think it's a process.
Do you see the medical schools of tomorrow bringing teachers from other social sciences and other areas of human knowledge, not specifically directed to physiology and other things that they learn in med school today?
Yeah, they must. And that's the thing is that artificial intelligence agents are going to be able to do a lot of what we do now in medicine and many other fields much better than we humans do. But there are certain things that we humans will do for a very long time, at least much better than the AI. And that's connecting with people. It's listening It's seeing a whole person not as a problem set, but as a comprehensive being. And I think though that's the area where there needs to be a lot more focus and investment and growth. And then within medicine, you get there's a selection bias, at least now, for the kinds of people who want to go into it. And so I think that kind of constant growth and building that into the and not just the education, but the job will be essential.
What can we, I guess that the question you're always trying to answer, because at the same time you're an idealist and you talk about ethics in general. And how can we decide or think about deciding what can we delegate to technology and AI and what we must take the responsibility ourselves?
Yeah, on that, it's pretty easy in the sense that there's just going to be a bunch of stuff that AI does so much better than we do, that trying to do it yourself will just be a risk. And so I think right now there are certain areas where there's, maybe you can have a human radiologist see whether you have a certain type of cancer, or you can do the AI. But very, very soon, at least for certain types of cancers, having a human radiologist do that analysis is just dangerous. But we'll want to have humans reviewing those things. We want to have humans setting the parameters of what machines do and don't do, of what we're comfortable with. And we may want to introduce inefficiencies in the name of morality, humanity, or other things. But it would just be silly if we kind of held on. I mean, there'll always be kind of artisanal people doing artisanal things. But there are a lot of things that we just do by machine, like create bottles. We could have individuals creating bottles. We wouldn't have as many bottles. And I think we should let those things go and then really invest in how do we become the best possible humans. And there's so much room for growth in that area.
I wanted to ask you about the One Shared World movement that you just fostered. But before that, I picture Jamie at the beginning of 2020, full of commitments, travel arrangements, speaking engagements. And then you're just constrained to your own desk in your home in New York, and everything changes for you, and you get this idea about something that has to do with the interdependence. How that spark really hit you, and how that spark really ignited into a big fire overnight?
Yeah. So you're exactly right. Until early March, that was my life. I was basically in a different country every week, speaking to different groups of many thousands of people. And it was actually a really, really great life. I've been just meeting so many amazing people all around the world all the time. And then the pandemic happened. In early March, I actually flew to Doha. It was the last trip. I was almost the only person on the plane, only person in the airport. I gave my Doha debates talk to an empty auditorium and then came back. And then life was just, since then, has been very, very different. And on March 17th, I was scheduled to give a talk for Singularity University for their COVID summit on whether the tools of the genetics revolution were a match for the pandemic. And that morning, I came to the conclusion that that's not really the most important topic. The most important topic is, why weren't we prepared for this pandemic? Which is the same as, why aren't we prepared for any pandemic? And why can't we solve climate change or ecosystem destruction or proliferating weapons of mass destruction or any of these big global challenges? And the answer was, there's a mismatch between these global challenges we face together and the predominantly national way we're organized to address them. And unless we fix that, everything else is just a detail. And so I gave that talk, and I said, what we need to do is we need to build a global constituency representing our common aspirations as humans. That talk went viral. I stayed up all night. A couple nights later, I drafted a Declaration of Global Interdependence, put it up on my website. That went viral. I called a global meeting. I think you were in that meeting. And then everything has grown from there. And now, One Shared World, we're in, I think, 110 community people from 110 countries. Our declaration is in 18 different languages. And it's growing really quickly. And I think that the reason is because I think this virus is showing us this gap in the world, that we have become a global species, but we haven't organized ourselves to solve global problems. And because our biggest problems are global, unless we solve them, we're going to go extinct.
I love the word you chose, interdependence. It speaks about independence, but interrelated. at the same time. And we've been talking about interdisciplinary thought and how all these areas are really connected in terms of how we get to know them. But we live in a world where knowledge is doing, is action. So how can we know the world by doing stuff with and to and from the world at the same time? I know this is some kind of abstract, but if we really want to change governments and policymakers and companies and everyone in general, how can we develop this interdependent thinking since we are children?
It's a really great question, especially from when we're children, because there's nothing built into children that makes them inherent patriots to the country in which they're born. Some little kid, you don't know you're born in Mexico. You don't know what Mexico is. Someone has to tell you there's a country, Mexico. You are Mexican because you're born here. And this means that you have all of these loyalties to people in Mexico. And you, when the World Cup, when Mexico plays against whoever it is, Italy or whatever, you're for Mexico. Like these there's nothing built in that does that other than this kind of us, them, which is part of our genetic makeup. And so there's a thing that we went from a species living in little bands to larger communities, villages, and then cities and countries. And now we just need to take that other step, which doesn't mean that you're not part of your own family or your community or your country, but it's just that we all need to internalize that we're part of something bigger and more collective. And that's a species, a single species, sharing with many other species a common home. And unless we have that consciousness, and unless we integrate a respect for the mutual responsibilities of interdependence into everything that we do and every organization that we're part of, including our governments, companies, civil society organizations, political parties, we're just not going to make it as a species. And there's a better path that allows us to grow, that allows us to recognize that we're all connected. The virus is showing us that. We know that a world of 3 billion people in abject poverty is not a stable world for anybody. So helping people get out of terrible poverty, it's not charity. It's an investment in building the world that we want to live in. I think, and interdependence is that frame. Certainly was my honor to play a little role in sparking this version. I mean, people have been talking about it. I'm not the first person to raise this idea. But hopefully at this moment, the experience of the pandemic, the shared experience of the pandemic is showing us what happens when we're divided. And certainly when the most vulnerable people are the people at greatest risk. But that risk is collateralized for everybody and the benefits that can accrue if we all come together.
Amazing. I'm really, I'll be posting something on the One Share World movement on the notes because I think it's great and more people should join and sign the pledge and volunteer. Yeah. Personal question. How do you manage your time and your energy on your daily routine? Because you get so many things done.
Yeah, no, I thought I was efficient before. Now with just sitting home, I've become just stupidly efficient, and it's just like everything in 15 minutes. So there's two answers. One is just being home and being kind of a person with this kind of personality. I like being very active. Doing so many things forces a level of efficiency. Certainly, I exercise every day and eat healthy, and I'm a terrible sleeper, but I try to get sleep. And frankly, the secret sauce of it all is not having any kids. I mean, people I know who have kids in quarantine are dying right now, just because. And I mean, they have all these kind of amazing blessings that I may not have. But so I just feel I have all this free time. I mean, before I was on a plane multiple times every week, and now I wake up and I'm right in my office.
Do you get hit by this scarcity mindset when you feel that you don't have enough time to do all the things that you want to do? And how do you manage that? Because at the end of the day, you do put the work in and the output gets done. So
I have, even with One Shared World, like in the beginning, I was being so tough with myself. I'm just and literally in those days when we were just starting, it was 17, 18 hours a day, 7 days a week for 4 months. And then I remember I hit a wall and I thought, I had to let go a little bit because I was holding on so tightly, even to something that I'm this passionate about. And I had to let go. And it was nice because when I let go, all these other people stepped up. And so that it's always a balance. I mean, de Gaulle had this famous quote, "The graveyards are full of indispensable men." And I just think that for everything that we're doing, as passionate as we may be about it, there's a time we just need to step back. And I mentioned I'm a bad sleeper. Sometimes I have a hard time kind of turning it off. And so I'm just like, what makes me so efficient in the day is that like I'm always, like I feel like my processor is always humming, but the things where you kind of have to just turn it off and do nothing, like sleep or meditation or all those kinds of things, I'm actually terrible at it. But we all have to learn that, especially now with the quarantine, because if we don't kind of regulate ourselves, we won't be sustainable.
Why do you believe that writing fiction and writing nonfiction is important, and how those two things inform themselves?
We are humans. We learn through stories. And so thinking about stories, it forces us to think about how just whatever we're exploring is relevant to people. And so certainly for me, my nonfiction informs my fiction, but even more importantly, my fiction, my thinking about storytelling and communicating that informs everything else that I do, because the things that we're talking about, they're not just specialist issues, they're societal issues. And whenever I hear, I mean, it's fine if you are within a small conference of super specialists, you should speak the language of specialization. But for all of us who have some kind of knowledge that needs to be shared, we need to share it not based on the way that's comfortable for us, but in the way that people can hear what we're trying to communicate.
When you talked with, you are always on the news media and you advise governments and you advise the World Health Organization and all these important groups of people, how much of your opinions are about what's happening and the problems that we need to face, while at the same time telling new stories and fostering the power of imagination and new possible worlds? It's
both. I mean, and that's for me, I guess technically, even though it's a made up title, I'm a futurist. But when I talk, a lot of my media is on talking about things that are happening now. And the way I think about it is at every moment in your life, there are just these different possible futures. And for society, right now, there are these different possible futures. And even now, as I talk about this as a 1918 moment, some of them are pretty good. And some of them, like in the aftermath of World War I, are pretty horrible. It's almost like an Italo Calvino reference. But so for me, that's the thing, is if you're just imagining the future and it's not tethered to people's present reality, it's fine. That's pure science fiction. And if you're just talking about now, especially about problems now, and you're not articulating a path forward that's hopeful, then that's really hard for people. So what I try to do is find that balance.
And how do you think people are inclined about thinking those possible futures in these groups of people who really hear you speak? Do they like it, or do they prefer to focus on
I think people like it. I think this is a very dangerous time. There's a lot of pessimism. There's a lot of despair. It's hard for people to be home. I mean, there's people with kids who are home. It's hard to have kids. I know I have a lot of friends who are single people without partners, and whoever they are, sitting home alone for 5 months, even if you're on 3 million Zooms every day, it takes its toll. So these are really difficult times. We need to acknowledge that. But I think that, and there are a lot of people who are trying to use the language of despair and division and disruption in order to rally people. And it's actually a very effective way. It plugs right into the way our brains function. But hope is I hope, more powerful. And so I think that building, and that's why One Shared World has been very meaningful to me, and I think to a lot of other people, is it's kind of built this community of all these other people who are kind of sitting at home saying, all right, well, now what happens?
I have to ask, before I ask my last question, which nonfiction authors are currently reading, and what are your best fiction writers?
So right now I'm reading a nonfiction book that I'm really enjoying, connected to what we talked about with One Shared World, and that's called A World Parliament by Andreas Bummel. Actually, I have a call with him tomorrow, but it's really looking at the history of this effort to kind of build kind of a global infrastructure to solve global problems. I personally don't agree. I don't think we need to build a world parliament. I don't think the world is ready for it. But we certainly have to build a global consciousness and a global responsibility and infuse that into everything that we do. So that's certainly a book that I recommend. In terms of my fiction authors who I love, and this is, I'm not just sucking up to the Spanish-speaking world, but Borges, every kind of great idea that you can think of, somehow Borges has already thought of it. So I just like Ficciones it's such a small, but just such a brilliant book. Kawabata, the Japanese Nobel laureate, I really like. And then of living writers, Richard Powers is just, I think, fantastic. And he signed the One Shared World Pledge of Interdependence.
Wow. There's a saying that, scientists, take a long time to get to something. And when they find it, they say that a poet has already been there and that poets do fly direct.
That's true.
So when's your next marathon now that everything has been halted?
Yeah, well, so we have no marathons planned. We have no Ironmans planned. There are not many ultra marathons planned. So I'm just going to have to do a DIY. But later today, I'm actually in Colorado right now. I'm going to do a beautiful trail run and my own little personal marathon. Okay, well, my last question would be just, I think we understand what you want your legacy to be, but how do you see yourselves in the next 10 years? It's a great question. So certainly I would like to, in two different areas. One, I'd love for One Shared World to be part of growing not just a global consciousness about how we can come together to address our greatest shared challenges, but just to be part of the solution. I mean, this is really, it's an existential moment. We've had these kind of moments before that have been on the aftermath of much more devastating experiences like the Second World War or the 30 Years' War. So it may be that the pandemic isn't a big enough disruption to force us to think differently, but I really hope that we can, because if we don't, our ecosystems are going to collapse. We're going to have terrible refugee flows because of systemic poverty and inequality. So that's one. And second, for the work on kind of the future of the genetics and biotech revolutions, we are moving into these very, very unknown territories, which are going to be very uncomfortable for people. And like everything, there's a better path and a worse path. The better path is inclusion, diversity, mutual respect. And the worst path is a lot of division and disruption. And so I certainly, these two paths that I'm on, I see myself continuing. Having said that, on early this year, I would have given you a different answer. So crazy stuff happens in this world, and I hope we all have the wisdom to stay on the path that we've been on as much as possible, but to pivot as much as we need to be the change and drive the change that we'd like to see in the world. Jamie, I want to thank you very much. You probably have a CNN interview after this, and then you'll be advising some government and then talking to the UN. So thank you for making the time. And I'm saying that because when I met you and we were in a breakout room in San Diego last year, you were really gracious and humble, and you were really interested in seating everyone in the same circle and sharing their own lives and experiences. And you were really interested in everyone's story. And we don't get that much from people who are really busy and important and futurist, thinking about the future. And I think that's a trait that I really, will strive in my life to do, because at the end of the day, it's about connection. So, since the first day I met you and I saw you smile before I saw you speak, I got the whole picture. So thank you so much, my friend. Yeah, that really means a lot to me. Thank you so much, Victor. It's really my pleasure and my honor to be with you. Have a great day. All right. Thanks, Victor. All righty. Bye-bye.
Nos encantaría recibir tu retroalimentación de estos podcasts para continuar generando contenidos que te sean útiles e interesantes. Si puedes, déjanos un comentario en la página web victorsaadia.com.